ago. I haven't turned it on. Yeah, my name got popular because in the 10th century, there was an Irish king who's named Brian Bora. And there really weren't many famous Brians before that time, but that took over and caused my name to become very popular among the Irish. And in the year I was born, which is 1969, Brian was one of the top 10 names. It's kind of fallen out now. Not as many people are named Brian. But I wish I had a great story for why I was named Brian. And I honestly, I just think either my mom or my dad thought, yeah, yeah, we got to call him something. You know, we want to make sure that we gotta give him something to where when we holler at him, um, he comes to find us. My brother was named Christopher. My older brother, not my oldest. He was named Christopher, which means bringer of Christ. I'm like, well, that would have been cool. But I'm named Brian, which basically means hill. Um, if you want to think it means noble, I'll take that too. But it basically means hill. A lot of times when we come across names in the scripture, you know, it's one of the few ways that we have to try and read into the story what is really trying to be said. And a few weeks ago, we looked at the name Moab, which means, you know, of my father, descended from my father, which was, you know, that was Lot, and his daughter had a child, and she kind of named him just right on the nose, of my father. We saw Naomi's husband last time, Elimelech, which means God is my king, God is king. And however, when you look at Moab, you say, yeah, that's kind of right on the nose there. And you look at Elimelech, and not so much. You don't see his name bearing fruit out in his life. But Naomi, our central character, I think, in this story, had a name that I think has a very clear meaning, and she's going to cause it to have even more meaning in the passage that we looked at this week. Her name means pleasant or beautiful. Now, I don't know, ladies, how much you'd enjoy to have a name that means pleasant or beautiful. It's like I think if you got a name like that, you think your parents are trying. You know, they're doing their best. They're trying to give you something that'll make you feel good about yourself and those around you. But as we pick up the story, we're going to see that Naomi is going to take issue with her own name. It begins in Ruth, chapter number 1. We left off at verse 18. This week, I'm going to go ahead and warn you. I'm going to combine two lessons. I'm not going to give the whole of them, but I am going to combine two because I'm grateful to Pastor Wade for jumping in my absence, but we're going to run out of summer if I don't go ahead and get through this. So Ruth, chapter number 1, beginning in verse 19, it says, so the two of them, that is Ruth and Naomi, went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? That word stir there implies that there really was a great excitement about her. And this is a small town. Bethlehem's a small town. Don't think that it's a thriving metropolis or anything. It's the kind of town where one thing happens on this side of town and it's known on the other side of town pretty quickly. And so the women of Bethlehem thought they recognized Naomi. Now, granted, it's been at least 10 years since she's been gone, and a whole lot of life has happened to her since she's been gone. So they're excited, but they think this could be the same woman that they knew. And they say this. It sounds like they're saying it within earshot of her. And when she heard them ask the question, is this Naomi? She said to them, do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara. Now, Naomi means beautiful, precious. Mara means bitter. And so it would be the equivalent of someone, saying, hey, pretty, hey, precious. And you responding and saying, don't call me pretty. Call me bitter. I am changing my name. Now, she tries to change her name here, and whether or not she's being serious about it, it really doesn't matter, because nowhere throughout the rest of the book does the author refer to her as Mara. But she is definitively making a statement, not about her liking or not liking her name. She is making a statement about God with this. And it's something I want you to pay close attention to, because this is the kind of stuff that probably makes us a little on the nervous side when we hear somebody say it. So listen, call me Mara, for the Almighty, that's El Shaddai, the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? Why call me beautiful? When the Lord has testified against me, that's a term that's used in court. He has testified against me, and the Almighty, El Shaddai, has brought calamity upon me. Now, I don't know if you have been in many instances where you have been so bold as to talk about God like that, or if you've heard somebody else be so bold as to talk about God in those terms. God is not good. God has testified against me. God is against me. God has brought calamity upon me. God has taken me full and handed me back empty. And so she is looking, she's not taking into account, her husband probably made a really bad decision when he left Bethlehem. Took them off to a really wicked, evil place. They got embedded in that culture, and bad things happened to them. And God did a whole lot to bring Naomi back to Bethlehem. But it's so easy as you look, from her perspective, it's because God's against her. Now, I think, don't we kind of all have this just innate feeling that we're not supposed to talk about God like this? Right? And if you hear somebody talking about God like this, what's your knee-jerk response? What's your reaction? Well, what would it be? You hear somebody talking about God like this. So you correct them, or would anybody warn them? You better not do that. You better not talk about God like that, because he'll get you. Well, you know that God ain't looking for an opportunity to get you. He's already got all the opportunities he was ever going to need. And if he hadn't taken up on them to this point, But so there's something in us, though, that when we hear that, it's like, oh, gosh, you're not supposed to talk about God like that. That's not how you're supposed to talk about him. But do you know that there's quite a bit of Scripture where people talk about God like that? If you look through, everybody thinks Job right off the bat, but interestingly, it's a whole lot more in the Psalms. The largest section of the scholars have divided up the Psalms into different types, and one of the main type is a lament. It's known as a lament. And in a lament, a charge is brought. And sometimes that charge is brought against another nation or another person who's coming against you. But very often, that charge is brought against God. I'm gonna read you a few illustrations that make what Naomi just said seem a little tame, okay? There's two types of laments. One of them's communal, where where somebody is bringing an accusation as if it's from the whole of the community. So this is a a maskil of the sons of Korah. And nobody really knows what a maskil is, but it's from a group. It's not written from David. And here is the song that they're singing, okay? Oh God, we have heard with our ears, our fathers have told us, what deeds you performed in their days, in the days of old. You, with your own hand, drove out nations, but them you planted. You afflicted peoples, but you set them free. For not by their own sword did they win the land. You did with your own arm. But your right hand and your arm in the light of your face, you delighted in them. So he's saying, we've heard about what you've done back in the day. Now listen to this. You get down to verse 9. But you've rejected us and you've disgraced us. You've not gone out with our armies. You've made us turn back from the foe. You made us like sheep for slaughter. You sold your people for a trifle. You made us the taunt of our neighbors. You made us a byword among the nations. All day long, my disgrace is before me, and shame has covered my face at the sound of the taunter and reviler, at the sight of the enemy and the avenger. And all this has come upon us. Now listen, though we haven't forgot you. Okay, this is recorded, inspired by the Holy Spirit in the Scripture. And so basically, these guys are saying, listen, God, we prayed about this and we figured out that the problem's you. Okay. That's some intestinal fortitude, I guess. And you can read more, I guess, personal ones in Psalm 13. How long, O Lord, will you forget me, and how long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? And pretty strong words. You'll probably recognize Psalm 22 because of a different context that it was used in. Psalm 22 starts out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Quoted by Jesus on the cross. Why are you so far from saving me, from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you don't answer, and by night I find no rest. If you'll read on, you'll find out that some of these guys turn it around and they come back to a place of worship, but they're saying some pretty hard things about God, aren't they? Psalm 88 is another one, but I think I'm going to stop there. The point being that what she's doing right here isn't really that uncommon in the Scriptures as you might think it is. We have this idea of we've got to say the right thing, do the right thing in order to get blessed, behave the right way in every instance. And I'm going to tell you what Naomi is doing here, the best thing you can say about it is it's honest. She genuinely believes that. And so what she genuinely believes she's saying, but what she's doing is not really a lament, because she's not talking to God and giving him her complaints. She's talking bad about him to other people. Kind of makes it worse, doesn't it? Elizabeth, you mentioned Job. I grew up here and, it's like, oh, the patience of Job. I honestly have no clue where that idea or concept came from. I know he starts off really well. He loses everything, and his response is, the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. But then he takes a deep breath. And here's the next thing that comes out of his mouth. This is as early as chapter 3. Let the day perish in which I was born. Wish I'd never been born. You get down to chapter 9. He says, he, that is God, crushes me with a tempest and multiplies my wounds without cause. He'll not let me get my breath, but fills me with bitterness. Though I'm blameless, he would prove me perverse. Therefore I say, now this is Job, Oh, patient Job. This is Job describing what he thinks of God. He says, therefore I say, he destroys both the blameless and the wicked. When disaster brings sudden death, he mocks at the calamity of the innocent. That's a hard word. And you know how he ends it? He ends it by saying, I call aloud, there's no justice. Here's my signature. Let the Almighty answer me. He said, this is the charge I'm bringing against God. I'm signing my name to it. Let the Almighty answer me. Now here's the difference between what you get in Psalms and what you get in Job. Because in Psalms, we don't have God's responses. In Job, we do. And his response is pretty amazing if you read the whole of it. But it says that the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. And he says this, he said, who is this that darkens counsel without knowledge? It's like, who is this who thinks he's going to tell me how to do things, but he doesn't know anything? And then he goes into this long diatribe of all of these things that Job doesn't know. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? He's like, where were you? You know? And Job listens to God, and the response that Job gives at the end of it is this. I've heard of you by hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself, and I repent in dust and ashes. Now, he got his pants dusted there is what he got. Okay? But I guess I'm going through the trouble of describing this because I hope you never get to the point where you think God is unjust, that God is against you, that God isn't for you. But if you do, the thing to do in that moment is to run toward him and make your complaint. And what we see from the life of Naomi, what we're going to see, what we see from David, what we see from those sons of Korah in Israel, what we see from Job is that he might dust your pants a little bit for what you're saying, but he's also the only place that all these problems are ever going to be redeemed. And so if you ever fall into that place where you're just like, God is mean. You know the person to tell that to is not somebody else. It's not even me for that matter. I mean, you can, but the real person to tell that to is tell it to God himself. There's plenty of illustrations of that happening in the scripture. And even though we might think that would be a path to getting, completely ignored or completely cast aside by God, listen, he's not nearly as emotional about things as we are. And he will actually seize those moments. He may rebuke you a little bit. I'm not going to say he won't talk to you the same way he talked to Job. But that honesty is probably a whole lot better response than, religious platitudes that you don't really mean. And so as I look at this story, I see that Naomi's biggest feelings about God going into chapter 2 are that he's a bully, mean, has robbed her, taken away everything that was good in her life. And so anything that happens to her from this point forward, and I pray you can hear me, not a consequence of Naomi's faith. Period. It's a consequence of God's goodness. There's absolutely no way to look at it any way different. So let's jump into chapter 2. We're going to go through this pretty quick. I think I'm going to take us all the way down through the end of this chapter. Now, Naomi had a relative of her husband, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech. That's her husband, whose name was Boaz. Boaz is a really strange name, and it's not repeated a whole lot even in Jewish culture. It's like they respected it. It describes him here as a worthy man, and there's a double use of words here that kind of is unnecessary. And so it's like they're saying that he's a good, great man. And in just about any instance where you see this, somebody's being described as very wealthy, yet of good character, or they're a warrior or something like that. And so this is a significant figure. Boaz is being described as a very central figure, not just in the clan, but even in Bethlehem. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." She doesn't know who that's going to be yet. But she said, "I'll just go looking for somebody that'll let me glean, and that's what I'll do." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. Now, you wouldn't know this if you didn't go back to pick through the law, but the law had some provisions for widows, and part of the provisions were that you're supposed to leave the corners of the field, the edges of the field, unharvested so that people could come along behind you and get a little bit that's left over. And on top of that, there's even a provision in the law that every third year, a tithe of your entire harvest would be set aside to help and feed widows. But even though those provisions of the law are set up, recognize we're living in the time of the judges. And one of the things that's most common is there's judgment that's come on, on Bethlehem. It's not a guarantee that people are going to follow that. And so when you do find somebody who's adhering to these laws, it's actually a great blessing. And so it says she set out, went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened. Okay? Happened. What, I don't know if that's the ESV's translation. I don't know if yours are going to be any different. She happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. Imagine a large expanse of field, but only a portion of it was Boaz's. And she's just out there amongst them, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. Now, there is an emphasis there that really doesn't come through in English because it's a redundancy. When it says she happened, what it literally says in Hebrew is that her chance was chanced upon. It's using both the noun and the verb form of this word. It's like there's emphasis being drawn to this. It just happened. It just happened. It's as if the writer is saying, and as luck would have it. But I want you to see that said in the sense of irony. That's going to be one of the big points that I want you to leave with tonight, is the fact that there is providence that's weaved in and out of this story that's never discussed. And the mentions that are made about God are not in reference to those amazing details that he's weaving together, but they're kind of passing and not acknowledging it. And here it just says she happened, her chance chanced upon, as luck would have it. Without any doubt, he's intending that to be ironic. Verse 4 says, "And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, 'The Lord be with you.' And they charged him, 'The Lord bless you.' And Boaz said to the young man who was in charge of the reapers, 'Whose young woman is this?'" So something about her stood out. I used to think it was because she must have been really good looking or something. But the truth is, this is a small town. I mean, he could have just noticed that she was new and different. There's nothing that really gives you a whole lot of clarity about why he noticed her there. But he noticed her. Now, when you hear dialogue in the scripture, most of the time it doesn't give you a lot of clues what the inflection of something is. Y'all know what I mean by inflection? Okay. Inflection is me looking at my grandchild and saying, "Come here," and me looking at my grandchild and saying, "Come here." Okay. You don't get the benefit of hearing, you don't get the benefit of that when you're just reading the text. And so I'm going to read this text in a way that I didn't always read. I didn't read it like this. But Boaz comes to his manager of the reapers and he asks a question. And I'm going to read this in the manner that I think it should be inflected. Because I don't think that the reaper, the man in charge of the reapers, was a fan of Ruth. And I'll tell you why in a minute. And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She's a young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Please let me gather and glean among the sheaves after the reapers.' So she came, and she continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest." Okay, now, when you read that, it seems somewhat innocuous, I know. But I think he's disparaging her. He called her a Moabite, referenced the fact that they were coming back from Moab, so referenced Moab twice, implied that she went out to glean, and then said, but she's also gathering from what she shouldn't, because she's gathering from among the sheaves that the reapers had. He's saying, listen, and on top of that, it's like you gave her a little, she took more, and on top of it, she doesn't even take breaks. She's been going at it all day. I think that this, for whatever reason, this man who's in charge of the reapers doesn't like Ruth. And I think he's making statements about her to try and incite Boaz against her. And so Boaz shows up and he notices her, and this guy says, "Yeah, let me tell you about her. Okay, she came in here acting like she owns the place. She's touching stuff she ought not touch, and she ain't even leaving any for anybody else." I think that's the sentiment that he's given there. And so imagine Boaz and this guy walking out into the field. No doubt that guy thought, yep, she's about to get it. He's going to jerk a knot in her tail, and he's going to tell her how it's supposed to be, and this Moabitess is going to get put in her place. But that's not at all what happened. It's not at all what happened. Boaz went up to Ruth in verse 8 and said, "Now listen, my daughter. Don't glean in the other field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women." Keep close is that same word there that's translated cling, when Ruth made a decision to cling to Naomi. It's the same word. Cling to the young women in this field. Let your eyes be on the field that they're reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? So my men aren't going to touch. Now that word touch there's the implication that they're not going to take advantage of you. It's like, and when you're thirsty, here's what you do. Go to the vessels and drink what's been set aside for the young men. Go and drink what the young men have drawn. In that culture, the women drew the water, gave it to the men. And here he's saying, the young men have drawn water, you get to go and take it to that. So this manager is going out there expecting that Ruth is about to get her comeuppance. And instead, Boaz flips that whole thing around and puts absolutely unexpected blessing on her and privilege on her. And to the point where it's in sharp contrast with the way that anybody else in the field is being treated. And definitely in contrast how the manager wanted her to be treated. And then in verse 10 says that she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him. That bow to the ground is the Hebrew word for worship. Not that I think she's worshiping him, she's just offering real thanks. And she says, why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me? You don't see it here, but the word for take notice and foreigner sound almost identical in Hebrew. And so she's saying, how have you noticed the unnoticeable? It's how have you noticed, how is it that I've found favor in your eyes? And Boaz answered to her. And something's going on with Boaz that we're not told about. He's become privy to information, and the story of how he got it isn't delivered to us. And so he says, he answered her, I'm doing this, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me. And how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you didn't know before. The Lord repay you for what you've done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Now, that's a description of God's providence working itself into these laws of sowing and reaping. You look at, when I told you 2 weeks ago when we were together last, I don't think there was any reason that would have justified Ruth making the decision that she made. And if Ruth was if she was my daughter, I would have looked at her and said, you do what Orpah did. That was the reasonable thing to do. But there was something in Ruth that said, no, I have to do this thing. And she did it not knowing that it was going to work out. She did it not knowing how the story ends. She did it, all she knew was she was going into a strange place around a strange people with no real promise that it was really going to be okay. And she had Naomi looking at her and saying, trust me, girl, it ain't going to be okay. You need to run. But God put something in Ruth, and she made an inexplicable decision. And here you see the laws of sowing and reaping, where she planted this faithful good act over here, and then in a different season, in a different place, in a different way, you see the good fruit of it coming up, because what Boaz is doing for her is, at least in part, inspired by the fact that he heard that she did such a selfless thing to one of his family members. And the word of that good thing made it back to the ears of Boaz. And we don't even know how that happened. There's no description of Naomi telling anybody about what happened to her, but she definitely didn't tell Boaz. And so somehow it got back to the ears of Boaz. And Ruth was blessed in a very unexpected place. It's a good instruction about the law of sowing and reaping. Just because you plant here doesn't mean you reap here. You can plant here and you can reap all over the place. And then in verse 13 it says that she said, I found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I'm not one of your servants. That word for servant there is like the lowest servant, the lowest of the low. And then at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. That word wine there could just likely be some type of vinegar. But when they got together to eat, when Boaz was feeding all of his workers, he brought her in and he brought her to the table. And he sat beside her, or he called her in. You know what makes your presence at any table acceptable? The person who owns that table has to invite you. It doesn't matter what the table is or where the table's at. If whoever owns the table invites you, your presence there is acceptable. And Boaz invited her to his table, and he let her know that she was valued there, and even serving her himself. It's not a whole lot different. I probably would have, went after this a little bit more if I'd taken more time, but Lord really is painting that picture of the Lord's Supper where he invites us to be a part of his table. And when we're invited to his table, it's okay for us to be at the table. And what makes it okay for us to be at the table is the fact that we've been invited to it. And so she eats. There's some even left over that she puts aside and she's going to take to Naomi. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves. That's not the leftovers. That's the stuff that's been set aside for him. He said, don't reproach her. And also pull out some of the bundles for her and leave it for her to glean. Drop some of the good stuff and leave it there that she can pick up and grab a hold to. And he says, don't rebuke her. So he's going next level overboard, offering her good things. So she gleaned in the field until evening, and she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Truth be known, there's not a whole lot of uniformity in thought when it comes to what some of these ancient measurements were. But the thing that made the most sense to me is I came across a couple of people who agreed that this is anywhere from between 30 to 50 pounds of barley. Okay? When the expected daily gleaning should have been around a pound, because that's what you would expect that's how much you needed for an individual to get through the day. You need about a pound. And so she got enough to last for weeks at least a week for two people, probably enough for weeks. And here's a good thing. Listen, harvest lasted somewhere between the barley and the wheat harvest, probably around 7 weeks. And this story is going to end by her going back out and continuing to do this for quite some time, which means she's going to get enough barley and wheat during that time to feed her and Naomi for at least half of a year and possibly for the whole of it, depending on how these measurements worked out. But she's walking back home not with a little basket. She's walking home with, something thrown over her shoulder. It was a whole lot. It's a huge amount for one day. Verse 18 says, she took it and went into the city. Now, remember, I've told you that I believe that Naomi's the focal point of this whole thing. I think Naomi is, that she's the point that this story is about redeeming her and redeeming all that was lost in her life. She took it and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. And she also brought out and gave her the food that was left over after she was satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. Now, Naomi just really shocked by the amount that was put out to her. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, the man's name with whom I worked today is Boaz. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living and the dead. And Naomi said to her, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. Now that word redeemer there is going to become a very important word as this continues. It's the word goel. It means guardian, redeemer. The things are put together. It's really years ago it started being understood as kinsman redeemer. It's probably the better understanding of it. And I'm going to talk about that more in our next time together. But this is a person who could change everything for them according to the law. And Ruth the Moabite said, besides, he said to me, you shall keep close to my young men until they have finished all my harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it's good, my daughter, that you go out with as young women, lest in another field you be assaulted. So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So you got month and a half, maybe as much as 2 months, where she's going out and she's collecting enough to sustain her, maybe even enough to sell. And through the whole thing, it's not that there's no mention of God whatsoever, but when you look at the story the way it is, I want you to think about, with all of the provision that God's making in so many random ways and so many tied together ways, though, think about how little he's credited for it. How, there's no mention of seeking God for wisdom in any of this story. There's no mention of worship. The closest thing that comes to worship is Ruth bowing down to Boaz, and she really was just showing honor. She wasn't trying to worship there. Boaz does make a statement saying that he hopes that God's going to bless Ruth. That's good. Naomi hopes that God's going to bless Boaz as well. But other than that, there's no real prayer. There's no asking for direction. There's no worship. In fact, the closest thing that happens to any of that, I guess, is when Naomi introduces the story by fussing about God and making a case for why he is against her. And it's the most explicit statements about God that she makes in the whole chapter. And so you've got people who are not in any sense, Moab, it's not, we don't even know if Ruth is in relationship with the Lord yet. I suggest that she's being led by him, but I don't know if she's in relationship with him yet. No, Naomi's mad at him, and Boaz is not sure exactly what his place in this story is yet. But God is at work in all three of them. And even when it seemed like the enemy was trying to work in and mess Ruth's situation up there, I think there's probably a pretty good case to be made that she was about to leave the field when Boaz showed up because the workers weren't being very kind to her and possibly even taking advantage of her. Then Boaz shows up and he makes everything change. He invites her to the table. He makes provision for her. Yet in this story, what you see is Naomi at the beginning of it calling herself cursed and being very bitter at God, criticizing him, speaking it to random women in town. Don't call me beautiful. Call me bitter. But then, apparently on the very first day that Ruth goes out to glean, she chanced to chance upon. Remember? When she happened to happen happily. Just like, there was as luck would have it. She went to a field, and in that field she found herself in the section of it that was owned by Boaz. And even though there was this middle management dude who didn't like her, right about the time he may have been starting to do something ugly to her, Boaz shows up and he responds to what Ruth has done and who Ruth is and how she's behaving. No doubt Ruth is acting desperate because she's there to feed not only herself but also somebody else. And she may have looked a little bit greedy, but Boaz looked at it and said, listen, I know what this woman's here for. She's here to feed herself. She's here to feed somebody else. And that somebody else that she's trying to feed, I know that's my family. And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to let her get all that she can carry. In fact, we're going to bring her in. We're going to feed her. We're going to get her strength up. And then we're going to send her back out. And we're going to make it to where every last bit that she can possibly gather up by herself in a day, she's going to take it. And we're going to let her do that for weeks and weeks and weeks. And the consequence is that Ruth gets protected, she gets provision, and she experiences real kindness. And then she takes that report back to Naomi. And what's the last thing we heard from Naomi? God hates me. He hates me. He's against me. He's testified against me. And then you see Ruth go out, and all of these good things happen to Ruth, but who experiences all the benefit of those good things? They're brought back to grumpy Mara Naomi. And if you're not careful, you can read through this and just not think a whole lot about how much God is doing and say, oh, wow, what a coincidence. Are you ever tempted to look at something that happens in life and just, what a coincidence? That's kind of, how random. Use words like fate or luck. I want you to walk away from this tonight recognizing that just like Naomi, we don't always have to have the best attitude. We don't always have to have the right understanding. We don't always need to be emotionally in the best of places. And we can speak our mind from time to time, even though our mouth is filled with foolishness. And in spite of all of those things, in spite of the fact that we can't see God's hand at all, does absolutely nothing to change the fact that God's hand is everywhere. It's everywhere. Wade made mention earlier that yesterday was, I don't know how many years, 48 years that he came to Augusta. When he came to Augusta, he was a staff evangelist at a church, and the church is now Macedonia down Wrightsboro. If you ever pass by it, that's where. Well, he stayed. He was here for a while and wound up wandering around town to get. The pastor sent him out and said, "Figure out who's really on the roll and who ain't on the roll." And so he'd go into places, people who hadn't been to church in a year, and say, "Hey, you on the roll?" And he's like, so he was cutting people out of the Lamb's Book of Life is what he was doing. And pastor eventually, I forget what happened, he stepped down. Wade became pastor there, made it, 6 months? 8 months. I undershot it. And then they kind of had a little of they had one of those, they had a revival over a business meeting. They show up on a Wednesday night when, you see more people at a business meeting than you ever see on Sunday morning. Something's up. And I had one of those moments, and I look back. Pastor, I think about it from time to time that those were horrible moments for you. And but from that, okay, he met Miss Ann, and there was a whole lot more involved in that. But from that, Miss Ann came along. Been a part of his life now for how many decades? 43. And so that's 43 years. That's the birthplace of Grace Fellowship. That's the reason I came to Augusta. I don't know if in the midst of that he had a picture of, it's like, boy, God is up to something big here. God is up to something good. Praise the name of the Lord. I don't know if I have had those moments either when stuff was hard and it didn't make any sense. But, y'all, whether you can see his hand weaving together and working stuff to bring ever-increasing glory to himself, but also making all things work together for good for you. Naomi didn't have eyes to see it. Hear me. Ruth didn't have eyes to see it. Boaz probably didn't recognize that he was in the midst of God's big plan. Hear me. To bring the great king to Israel, who would be the ancestor to the great Savior of the entire human race. Think any of them had a big picture idea? And so you might look at it and say, well, I'm just at the point where I'm wanting to lament and say, God, you're mean. You're a bully on an anthill with magnifying glass. I was full and you brought me back empty. It's okay if, I don't think God gets nearly as offended by that as we think we might. He may look at you like he did Job and say, just who in the world do you think you are? You know? But at the end of the day, he redeemed Job. And he redeemed Naomi. And so if you ever find yourself in that place where it's just like, I don't see how God can be in any of this, that doesn't change the fact that he is.